On a bitter winter night, there at the family estate, my adopted son and his wife abruptly commanded my paralyzed 100-year-old father, still in his wheelchair, and me to get out and go. "It's time for both of you to pack up and leave. This party has no room for freeloaders." I stood there unable to move while the front door was thrown shut behind us. Then, barely minutes afterwards, 6 vintage luxury cars came roaring through the darkness up the driveway. A commanding figure climbed out, inclined his head with quiet deference toward my father, and spoke. "Sir, the trap is set. Welcome to Grandpa's Revenge, a place where the quiet ones finally get to be heard. If stories like this one find you at the right moment, consider subscribing and leaving a like. It means more than you might think. Before we get started, drop a comment and tell me, is this your first time here, or have you been listening for a while? I'd genuinely like to know. Now, a word before we begin. This story contains fictional elements woven in for the purposes of storytelling and dramatic effect. Any resemblance to real people or actual events is entirely coincidental. It is the truth inside the story that matters, not the names. The suit was 12 years old, and I knew it the way you know something that has been with you long enough to stop being a possession and start being a fact. I had bought it at an estate sale in Lexington for $35 on a Sunday morning in November, 12 years after I stopped expecting things to come easily. Classic American double-breasted 3-button, the sort of cut that holds its dignity at a graduation or a funeral alike and demands only that whoever puts it on means something by doing so. The wool had outlasted my care of it, which had amounted most occasions to pressing it flat on the kitchen table with a damp cloth, since I had never gotten around to owning an ironing board. The cuffs had always been a quarter-inch too long, and the week I brought the suit home I had stayed up past midnight at that same table and hemmed them by hand with kitchen twine, the only thing in the drawer strong enough to hold and fine enough not to announce itself. The twine was still there, 12 years on every loop, seated exactly where I had left it. I straightened my tie in the mirror of the downstairs guest room a second time and told myself that would do. The face looking back was 58 years old. It had arrived at its settled expression sometime in the mid-40s and seen no compelling reason to adjust it. Not unhappy, not beaten, only present in the manner of men who have trained themselves to rest their focus on the thing directly ahead, rather than the unanswerable territory beyond it. I had always found that discipline more productive than its opposite. My father was behind me in his wheelchair at the window. Cyrus Whitfield, 100 years old. The man who had handed me his name, his house, and the kind of formation that only comes from watching someone act decently, without deviation for decades, and never once look around to see if anyone was taking note. He sat with both hands resting on the oak armrests, the chair I had built him 11 years ago from timber. He had milled himself out of a fallen white oak on the eastern edge of the property. His gaze aimed somewhere well past the frost-whitened glass, past the grounds and the iron gate and the tree line swallowed in darkness at something I couldn't locate and had given up trying. To the party guests that evening he would have read as a man whose inner life had switched off along with his speech. The stroke came in the winter of 2008 and took both at once, no warning given. 15 years without a word. 15 years in that chair, while the household arranged itself around his silence, the way a room will eventually arrange itself around a load-bearing wall, treating it as structure rather than presence. I had never accepted that reading, not on a single day across those 15 years. I knew my father. "Big night," I said, working the top button of his flannel shirt, closed the faded blue one, worn to softness by years of washing, the one that predated most of my clear memories. Brendan made the regional business journal, 35 under 35. Nadine ordered the catering menu a week in advance. Nothing. There never was. But when I pressed the collar down smooth with my thumb, I caught the faint, deliberate movement of his right thumb against the oak armrest. A single press unhurried the way a period lands at the close of a sentence written in a language that only 2 people have ever spoken. I let it go unacknowledged. 15 years had been instruction enough on that. The Whitfield estate in December bore almost no resemblance to itself in any other season. Winter pared it down, took away the softness that grass and foliage lend a place, and exposed what lay underneath stone foundations. Iron fencing oaks stripped to their limbs and older than the house by a generation. It was the beauty of a thing that makes no concessions, that exists entirely without appeal to your comfort. The main hall met us with full blaze when I wheeled my father through the entrance. 6. Waterford crystal chandeliers, all original to the 1961 renovation, broke the light into shards across marble floors that had come out of a quarry in northern Italy and been set by craftsmen brought over for that purpose alone. A 14-foot Christmas tree stood at the center of the room, its theme described by Nadine to the event coordinator as winter formal, a phrase that turned out in practice to mean $3,000 worth of coordinated ornaments in silver and white, none of which had ever been touched by a child. 30 guests circulated in black tie, champagne in hand, sustaining the particular register of conversation that functions mainly as proof of attendance. Nadine had positioned herself near the mahogany sideboard. 42 years old, a deep burgundy gown ordered 6 weeks out from a designer I couldn't have named and whose work I couldn't have separated from anything else at twice the cost. She ran the catering staff the way someone runs a thing when they've spent enough years mistaking control for authority that the error has become invisible to them. Across 9 years of marriage to my son, she had never put a question to me about myself that wasn't a vehicle for some other inquiry. She didn't glance up when I pushed my father's chair through the room. Brendan held the space near the fireplace the way he had trained himself to hold spaces, positioned a step outside the cluster he was addressing, carrying the particular ease of a man who understands that a room will eventually turn toward stillness if he simply provides it. 43, broad across the shoulders, wearing a charcoal suit cut for him by a Back Bay tailor, whose name he surfaced in conversation often enough that I'd stopped filing it as a detail and started filing it as a statement. I had raised Brendan from the age of 7. His parents had died on a highway outside Augusta, Maine on a Tuesday morning in March when he was old enough to grasp what had happened and too young to have built anything capable of holding that weight. A caseworker arrived at my office on a Thursday, carrying a file and wearing the expression of someone who has exhausted every prior arrangement. I was still operating a small consulting practice out of a rented third-floor suite in Somerville. I hadn't been looking for a son. I had made no preparations for one, but I took him home that Thursday evening because walking away and leaving him somewhere was a thing I wasn't capable of, whatever my readiness. He had learned to balance on a bike in this driveway. He had come to this table for 36 years. When he was 19, I spent 4 hours in a hospital waiting room on a Wednesday night, certain his appendix was killing him, then drove him home the following afternoon while he cataloged every failing of the hospital food for the full 40 minutes. I was genuinely content the entire way. Now he glanced up from across the room, found my face, and produced the small nod, the variety that technically registers as recognition while conveying in substance almost nothing. It was the nod of someone who has concluded the gesture covers the obligation and has not pressed further into what covering an obligation actually requires. Then his attention went elsewhere. I located the alcove off the back hallway, the widest unobstructed stretch I could find that kept my father away from the kitchen door and clear of the air conditioning vent that pushed cold air even in December. The wall register ticked steadily each time the heat kicked on. Dependable small. I locked the wheelchair brake, angled the chair out from the wall, and took the seat beside him. A server materialized inside a minute, not the one managing the main table, but a younger one still mapping the room. He set down a small tray bearing a single bowl. Butternut squash soup. Unassuming, considered exactly what I had arranged with the catering coordinator 3 days prior, knowing my father required food that could be administered slowly with care without any fuss around it. The main table had crab bisque. I lifted the spoon and started. 3 spoonfuls in, I felt rather than saw Nadine moving across the room toward us. She crossed the floor the way she crossed every floor at her own events, purposeful with the lateral awareness of someone who is simultaneously monitoring 6 separate conversations. She drew up beside us, studied the bowl, then raised her eyes to mine with the look she kept for things that had failed a standard she'd set without asking anyone else. "The smell carries," she said. The volume was dialed down just far enough to suggest intimacy, the pitch set just high enough to carry. 2 couples nearby became very still in the careful way of people who have decided they did not hear. It's reaching the dining room. There's a chair in the laundry room off the back hallway. I set the spoon on the edge of the bowl. I looked at the room my father had built, at the chandeliers he had chosen, the marble he had laid, the tree, standing at the center of a space that existed because of 40 years of work, that nobody in it that evening was tracing back to its origin. I looked at my father's hands resting on the armrests of the wheelchair I had built from wood he had saved for something worth building. I said nothing. Nadine held a moment, then pivoted back toward her guests with the smooth, practiced ease of someone who has issued a directive and considers the matter settled. From across the room, Brendan had been watching. His eyes found mine again over the heads of 30 people who were very carefully tending to their own conversations, and he held them briefly. Then he lifted his glass by a fraction. The gesture of a man who has observed something, and after a moment's consideration decided that observation is the correct and sufficient reply. He looked away. I picked up the spoon. Beside me, my father's thumb pressed the armrest twice this time. The drive to Oklahoma took 2 days. I had considered flying. Harvey Orville had offered the company plane on 2 separate occasions, the second with the quiet persistence of someone who had already mapped out a flight plan and was simply waiting on authorization to file it. I turned him down both times. I had spent 30 years arriving places by air, stepping out of terminals, having skipped over everything in between the departure gate and the destination, and I was no longer convinced that trade made sense. Callum didn't push back on the decision. He lifted the road atlas from the shelf in the front hallway, the one my father had used on every cross-country trip since 1980. Its pages worn soft from handling and annotated at the margins with a system of ink markings that meant nothing to me and must have meant everything to him, and placed it on the back seat of the truck without a word. We left the estate before 5 o'clock on a Wednesday morning in the second week of February. The grounds were still dark. I had been awake since 2:30, not because sleep had failed me, but because I hadn't reached for it. There was something about the quality of those early hours in that house in that February that I wasn't ready to surrender. The workshop light had been burning since Christmas Eve. I had thought about switching it off a dozen times and had not done so. I had stopped telling myself it was forgetfulness. Some things you leave lit because putting them out means conceding that something is over and you aren't yet ready to concede it. Callum took the wheel for the first stretch without being asked. He had absorbed my father's instinct for the right handling of a task, the understanding that certain responsibilities are better assumed quietly without announcement because announcing them would force the other person to either accept or decline, and neither answer was what the moment called for. I rode in the passenger seat and watched Massachusetts give way to Connecticut in the pre-dawn dark, and I didn't attempt conversation until we had crossed the state line and the sky had begun its slow negotiation from black toward gray. The folder in my lap held the 12 names. I had gone through it so many times since pulling it from the workshop that the folds had gone soft. Rosario Fuenmayor at the top, 32 years of service, the red notation still sharp on the page. 11 names below hers, field supervisors, engineers, operations coordinators at various points in the company's history, each one accompanied by a number, a figure, and a correction that had been deferred for reasons my father hadn't committed to writing, but which I had spent a month piecing together from the surrounding correspondence in that bottom drawer. The reasons were not complicated. They were the same reasons that always explain deferred corrections of this particular kind. Not deliberate cruelty, not indifference exactly, but the slow weight of institutional habit that allows wrong things to persist, not because anyone chose that they should, but because no one chose that they shouldn't. My father had understood this. He had set it down on paper. He had marked it in red ink, locked the evidence of it away in a drawer, and added a line in his final letter, acknowledging that he had been working to correct it for 4 years without sufficient urgency. That phrase had not left me since April, without sufficient urgency. It was the most unsparing self-appraisal I had ever seen a man of his generation put to paper, and the honesty of it made it heavier to carry, not lighter. We stopped for breakfast at a diner outside Hartford, the kind of establishment that has been open since before the interstate, with a counter running along the window and a menu that stays fixed because the people who rely on it don't want it to change. Callum ordered eggs, I ordered coffee, and then changed my mind and ordered eggs too. The woman who brought them was perhaps 65, moving with the compact efficiency of someone who has set breakfast in front of strangers for 20 years and stopped finding anything in it to remark on. She topped off my coffee before I asked and was gone without comment. I thought about Rosario Fuenmayor for the entire hour we sat there. I had read her 1991 letter often enough that I could have reproduced most of it without the page. The careful handwriting, the precision of the safety incident, the names of the 4 workers, the framing of her request so exact, it could not be misread as grievance. She had written to my father because every other door had closed and my father had responded, and the response had been enough for that particular event, but it had not touched the underlying conditions that had made the event possible. She had gone on working for the company for 32 years after sending that letter. I had worked out that number sitting at my desk at midnight the week before we left. 32 years. She had shown up every day for 32 years at a job she was equipped for, excelled at, and was underpaid for, and had never, as far as I could determine from the correspondence, raised the salary question head-on. Whether that was because she had tried elsewhere and been turned away, or because she understood the institutional answer well enough to spare herself the effort, or because she had concluded the work itself was worth more than the battle, I couldn't know from the documents. I would need to ask her. That was the only real reason I was making this drive, not to announce a remedy, not to hand over a check and a handshake and a statement about the new leadership's commitment to fairness. Those things would be handled through Harvey Orville and the HR department and whatever internal process the company maintained for adjustments of this kind, and they would be handled correctly and in full, and the 12 people on that list would receive what they were owed, with retroactive consideration reaching as far back as the legal structure permitted. But none of that required me to be there in person. I was going because my father had instructed me to go the way he used to go himself, early, without announcement, with enough time to sit down for breakfast with the people who kept the lights on. And because somewhere across the 4 months between Christmas Eve and this February morning, I had come to understand that the instruction wasn't about operational management. It was about something that resists clean naming in a business context, but that my father had practiced for 40 years, and that I had watched without fully grasping what I was watching. It was the conviction that anyone running a company ought to understand what that company costs, the people who make it possible, not in the abstract, not through reports and summaries and the filtered assessments of those who stand between you and the work, but directly, in the specific, irreducible experience of sitting across a table from a person and hearing what their working life has actually been. Callum and I drove through Pennsylvania in rain, through Ohio in a fog that thinned and burned off around noon, then into Indiana under flat gray sky as the light dropped and the land opened into the broad, particular darkness of the Midwest at the close of a winter day. We stopped at a motel outside Columbus. The room carried the smell of commercial cleaning solution and something older underneath it that no amount of cleaning had managed to reach. I slept better than I had in months. I was up before 4 o'clock. I took the small chair at the desk by the window and read back through the correspondence from that bottom drawer. One more pass, not the whole folder, but the Oklahoma Field Supervisor correspondence, the letters running from 2004 through 2018, the stretch when Eastern operations had been under Rosario Fuenmayor's direct management. These weren't new to me, but sitting with them in a Columbus motel room on the morning I'd finally come face to face with her was nothing like reading them at the desk back at the estate. A day's drive has a way of collapsing the gap between a document and the human being it describes. What stopped me going through them again wasn't what any individual letter said, not the grievances, not the operational updates, not the requests. It was something underneath all of that. Every single letter she had written carried the same baseline quality, not submission, not anger, but a flat, professional steadiness that said, between every line, that she had committed to the work, because the work merited commitment, had put forward her needs without leaning on the expectation of an answer, and had kept going either way. I couldn't read that quality without feeling that it had a name. It was precisely what my father had identified in the 1991 letter and had cited in his own files as his reason for keeping her on as supervisor and correcting her pay in that particular case. In his notes, he'd called it operational integrity, the phrase his generation reached for when they meant something that ran deeper than the term itself could convey. I returned the letters to the folder, closed the briefcase. Callum's knock came at 4:45. "Lobby coffee's going," he said through the door. "We can reach Tulsa by noon if we're moving inside an hour." I sat there looking at the briefcase, at the folder inside it, at the single page with 12 names on it. The red notations still clean, the corrections still unexecuted. "Give me 40 minutes, I said. I listened to his footsteps recede down the hallway toward the lobby. Unhurried, deliberate, the gait of someone who has already decided the place he's heading is worth arriving at fully present. He'd absorbed that from his grandfather. I doubted he was aware of the inheritance. I took the briefcase and went to wash up. Through the window, the dark over Columbus was just beginning to ease at the horizon, that tentative, non-committal pale seam in the east that hasn't yet agreed to become morning. The highway ran vacant in both directions. Somewhere ahead, past 1,200 miles of road still left between us, a woman who had given 32 years to a job she was owed more for was about to begin her Tuesday. I meant to be sitting across from her when she did. They weren't SUVs. That landed first. Not how many there were, not the way they'd rolled through the iron gate as if they owned the approach, it was the profile. low, long, curved, with an intention that nothing rolling off a current production line bothers with anymore. Rolls-Royce Silver Ghosts, Bentley State Limousines, vehicles that belong to a different century entirely, their coachwork so deeply black, it seemed to pull the falling snow into itself, the chrome catching the amber bleed of light from the house. I'd encountered cars like those behind glass in museums. I had never watched them arrive under their own power. 6 of them settled into a single row along the front drive, precisely spaced headlamps going dark front to back in succession, until nothing lit the scene but the house windows and the faint luminescence of the storm around them. Doors swung open. Out of each one stepped a man in a dark wool overcoat, and every man moved immediately to raise a large umbrella without direction, without a word exchanged, producing a canopied passage between the row of vehicles and the place where my father and I stood in the snow. Then the leading car released its passenger. He was perhaps 65, silver-haired, carrying the kind of authority that doesn't trace back to a bank balance but to a lifetime of being handed things of genuine weight and never mishandling them. His charcoal cashmere overcoat covered what was, even in that light, unmistakably a bespoke suit, 3 fittings minimum. No rack in existence could have produced it. His shoes were mirror bright in spite of everything the weather was doing. He crossed the snow toward us at an even pace, the pace of someone who has never rehearsed an entrance because he has never needed to. He passed Nadine without so much as a glance in her direction. She had materialized on the front steps at some point, I hadn't tracked when. She stood in her burgundy gown with a cashmere wrap around her shoulders, Brendan half a step behind her. I caught the sound of her saying something. The silver-haired man gave no indication he'd heard. He didn't turn, didn't break stride, didn't register her presence at all. He came directly to my father and me. He stopped 3 feet from the wheelchair. Then, and this is the image I have returned to every day since he went down to one knee in the snow. This man in his cashmere coat and his mirror-polished shoes bowed his head toward my father the way you bow toward someone whose standing you've never once doubted. He held that position, looked up at my father, and said 4 words just above a whisper. "The trap is set, sir." He stood, turned to me, and put out his hand. "Mr. Leonard Whitfield," he said, "my name is Harvey Orville. I have been for 42 years your father's attorney and the executor of the Whitfield Family Trust. I regret that the circumstances make this our first proper meeting. Your father wanted it done precisely this way." I took his hand. My legs felt approximate. Orville reached into his overcoat and withdrew a portfolio of dark burgundy calfskin, the kind of document case I associated only with photographs of men who sat at tables where the outcomes affected whole industries. He opened it with the unhurried ease of someone who had run this exact procedure in 100 rooms before and had never once been surprised by how it ended. From behind me, Nadine's voice came again, higher now, an edge in it. "Who are you people?" Brendan called out to no one in particular. "Mrs. Whitfield." Orville's voice didn't climb, didn't sharpen. It simply achieved a precision that made the surrounding noise irrelevant, the way a blade is precise. I would recommend listening carefully to what comes next. You will want to have heard it correctly. He turned back to my father, then to me, and began. "The man standing before you tonight," he said, his voice reaching across the frozen drive without effort, "has cared for his father without condition, without knowledge of any inheritance, and without expectation of reward for 15 consecutive years. He has done so while being treated in this house as something less than a guest." A pause. "His father's full legal name is Cyrus Raymond Whitfield, founder and sole owner of Whitfield Oil and Gas, a privately held enterprise currently valued at $11 billion. That number entered the cold air the way a stone enters still water. I heard Nadine produce a sound sharp, sudden, the sound forced out of someone by a blow they didn't see land. I heard Brendan's hand find the iron railing on the front steps. I kept my eyes on neither of them. I was watching my father. Cyrus sat in the falling snow, his hands on the oak armrests, his expression undisturbed, the same surface stillness it had worn for 15 years. But his spine, I caught it only after it had already happened, straightened, not for effect, not for the room. Quietly, the way a man settles into himself when he arrives after a very long wait at exactly the moment he was working toward. His thumb pressed the armrest 3 times. "There is considerably more," Orville said, his voice low, his hand moving to the next page. "But perhaps we should begin with the property you are currently standing on." She came down the front steps at speed, one hand on the iron railing, the other thrusting a folded document overhead, the posture of someone producing evidence in a proceeding they've already declared themselves the winner of. Nadine crossed toward us with the momentum of a person who had spent the entire evening waiting for the floor to tilt back in her direction. The burgundy gown, the cashmere wrap, the poised exterior she'd held through every word Orville had spoken, it all shed from her, as her heels broke through the frozen crust of snow with each stride. He signed it. She said it at a volume that left no one in doubt. Last night, witnessed and notarized. This house is Brendan's and mine, and every person on this property is trespassing. She extended the document toward Orville. He didn't reach for it. He examined it the way a physician examines a scan that holds no surprises, the full composure of someone who reviewed this particular document long before it was produced in front of him. "May I ask," Orville said evenly, "who drafted this?" Nadine's chin came up a degree. "Our attorney, Clifton Orville. 15 years of estate law experience. Every clause is airtight." Clifton Orville. The name was not unfamiliar. Nadine had introduced him into our lives 4 years back, framed as a trusted family advisor, quiet, measured in speech, and reliably positioned on Nadine's side of any conversation that touched the estate. Full trust had never come with Clifton Orville, though I'd have struggled to articulate the reason. What I hadn't known, what I was a few seconds from learning, was that he had been receiving a salary from my father's accounts for the better part of 3 years. Harvey Orville reached into the portfolio and withdrew an identical copy of the quitclaim deed, then laid both versions side by side on the leather cover, angling them toward the light. "Your attorney's drafting is correct," he said. "The problem is the signature." I studied the line. My name. A reasonable approximation of my hand, close enough that Nadine had taken it for real. But I spotted it instantly, the way you spot the gap between a genuine expression and a manufactured one once you've been taught where to look. The loop on the capital L. The crossbar of the T perched slightly too high. A small, intentional flaw I had built into my signature at 19 in those first years, working alongside my father. A signal private and shared only between us that translated as this document is something other than what it claims to be. "That is not my signature," I said. Nadine looked at me. Something shifted in her eyes, not full doubt, not yet, but its earliest precursor. "You signed it last night," she said. "After dinner. You don't remember because you drugged him," Orville said. His register stayed flat, utterly even. A mild sedative compound introduced into his evening beverage, enough to generate compliance and block memory consolidation. "We have a toxicology report." He turned a page. "We've held one since this morning." The thing moving behind Nadine's eyes darkened. Orville pressed on without interruption. "Under Massachusetts law, a signature procured through chemical impairment is fraud in the execution. The instrument is void from the moment of signing notarization and witnessing change nothing. Your attorney," he said, and that single word landed with the softest possible weight, "understood this when he prepared the paperwork. He has been working with our office for 31 months. Nadine turned slowly in Brendan's direction. Brendan was looking at the deed in Orville's hands as though it had deceived him personally. "But even leaving the signature entirely to one side," Orville said, moving into a new section of the portfolio, "there is a further matter that would have made this conveyance legally inoperable, regardless of how it was executed." He produced a second document letterhead of a firm unknown to me dated 16 months back. "The Whitfield estate carries a mortgage of $7.3 million. That mortgage was purchased from First Federal Bank of Boston by Whitfield Holdings, LLC, a limited liability company incorporated under Delaware law 14 months ago. At the time of acquisition, the original loan had been in default for 43 days, which furnished the bank with both the incentive and the legal authority to sell the note." He held the pause just long enough before moving on. "Every mortgage instrument in this country contains a due-on-transfer clause, also called an acceleration clause. What it means is straightforward. If ownership of the property changes hands without the written consent of the mortgage holder, the full remaining balance comes due at once. When you caused Leonard to execute that quitclaim deed last night, you triggered it. When you had the mortgage holder's representative," he indicated my father, "expelled from the property this evening, you completed the trigger." He regarded Nadine with the neutrality of a man reading aloud from an instrument panel. "Whitfield Holdings, LLC, has invoked its right to call the full loan balance. As the sole owner and designated representative of Whitfield Holdings, LLC, he turned to face me. That is Leonard. The property returns to his authority effective this evening." Nadine hadn't moved. The snow fell around her. "That's not possible," she said. We examined the mortgage registry. The holder appeared as a registered agent name. "Standard practice," Orville said, "for Delaware LLCs seeking to preserve privacy of ownership. Entirely lawful, entirely by design." Brendan lowered himself onto the bottom porch step, not as any conscious act. He simply ceased to remain upright. Beside me, my father's thumb, worked against the armrest 4 times, measured unhurried the rhythm of a man who had been counting toward this particular moment across a span of time I was only beginning to grasp. "There is more," Orville said, advancing to the next section. "Considerably more." That next portion of the portfolio was visibly heavier than what had preceded it. Orville didn't turn to it at once. Instead, he rested it atop the leather cover with a care I had learned to read as deliberate his method of extending a moment for people to collect themselves, not from any impulse toward mercy exactly, but from the professional recognition that facts absorbed by an unready mind rarely take their proper shape. "Before I continue," he said, "I want to bring someone forward." He looked toward the third car in the line and gave a brief nod. The rear door swung open and a woman stepped out, 52 or thereabouts, hair cut short and silver, carrying the settled self-possession of someone whose professional life takes place in rooms where the evidence either holds or it doesn't. She had on a charcoal wool coat and was carrying a hard-sided case roughly the scale of a large briefcase, the variety built for transporting laboratory samples. "This is Dr. Dorothea Fenlow," Orville said, "forensic pathologist and independent toxicologist. She has also been a trusted colleague of your father's for close to a decade, and has been a personal friend of yours, Leonard, since the two of you worked together on the hospital foundation board." Dorothea and I had shared that board for 6 years. She was among the most exacting people I had ever known, someone who kept her conclusions tethered to what she could prove and pursued proof only where she was already certain it existed. She gave me a brief nod. Her face held no surprise. That alone told me she had been living with the knowledge of this evening for quite some time. "Dr. Fenlow," Orville said, "whenever you're ready." She placed the case on the hood of the nearest vehicle, unlatched it, and swung it open toward Nadine and Brendan. 2 rows of sealed glass vials nestled in molded foam, every one of them dated, everyone holding a small measure of dark liquid. "T samples," Dr. Fenlow said. The tone was clinical, measured the voice of someone delivering results, not lodging a charge. "Specifically from the nightly herbal tea prepared for Cyrus Whitfield and brought to him each evening in his bedroom spanning the years 2018 through 2023. 47 samples in total, drawn at irregular intervals to ensure they were representative." On the front steps, Nadine had stopped moving entirely. "Every sample," Dr. Fenlow continued, "returns positive for 2 distinct compounds. The first is a heavy metal composite lead acetate predominating with trace mercury chloride administered in quantities consistent with chronic low-dose poisoning. The second is a category of immunosuppressant drugs ordinarily prescribed following organ transplantation, which in a person without that indication work to erode progressively the body's defenses against infection and its capacity to recover from illness." She let the next sentence arrive slowly. "In a 100-year-old patient carrying existing stroke damage, the combined impact of those agents across a 5-year course would manifest clinically as accelerated neurological decline and broad systemic deterioration, presenting to most physicians as unremarkable age-related progression." I had sensed at some level the direction Orville had been traveling, but hearing it delivered without softening, standing in the snow outside the house where my father had inhabited that wheelchair for 15 years, something left me in a way that the temperature had nothing to do with. Cyrus had known. He had known from the outset, and he had not spoken, and he had absorbed it, and he had outlasted it, and I was only now beginning to take in what that had demanded of him. "The samples," Dr. Fenlow said, "were gathered by Cyrus Whitfield personally. Across 5 years, he set aside a small portion of each night's tea before it reached his mouth, keeping the specimens in a sealed container built into the frame of his wheelchair. My office collected the container at regular intervals and conveyed it to our laboratory for analysis. I looked at the wheelchair. At the oak armrests, my hands had found 1,000 times. Somewhere inside that frame, inside the chair I had made with my own hands from timber out of our first backyard, my father had been patiently, systematically assembling what he needed. "The full findings," Orville said, resuming, "were delivered to the FBI's Elder Justice Initiative in October of this year. The unit has been running its own independent corroboration of the evidence for the past 2 months. Their conclusions align with Dr. Fenlow's." He moved to the next page. A separate matter concerns your personal physician, Dr. Aldous Hessler, who furnished falsified medical evaluations of both Cyrus and Leonard Whitfield in return for financial payment. That record is included in the same submission. Nadine stepped back one stair measured upward. Then she did something I hadn't anticipated. She turned toward Brendan, not reaching for strategy, not looking for an exit. She turned to him the way a person turns to someone when the world they have been living inside has come apart, and they need to find out if any version of it persists somewhere. "You knew," she said. The voice was barely there, all the performance burned away, only what was underneath remaining. "You knew what I was doing, and you said nothing." Brendan studied his shoes. Not a denial. Orville let the quiet settle before he spoke. "Mr. Brendan Whitfield," he said, his tone measured, "a conversation about the exact timeline of your knowledge will be necessary, what you were aware of, and precisely when." Brendan lifted his head by degrees. The cold glow from the windows caught his face at an angle that revealed a man who had long anticipated this moment, for whom its arrival carried something almost resembling release. Next to me, my father's thumb tapped the armrest 5 times. Then the quiet broke. A single pulse, Nadine's phone buried somewhere in the folds of her wrap. She let it go unanswered. A second buzz, a third, then a fourth arriving fast, each one a distinct tone, as though 4 different crises had all chosen the same moment to come looking for her. She drew the phone out with a hand that hadn't been steady since Orville spoke the $11 billion figure aloud. The screen was a wall of notifications, banking alerts stacking on top of one another in a column I watched lengthen from 10 feet away. The specific words were too small to read, but read I could recognize from anywhere. 4 separate institutions. 4 simultaneous alarm sets, all triggered inside a single 60-second span. Something happened to her face then that I had not witnessed once across 20 years. Nadine was a woman who kept her expression under lock and key, the way a practiced gambler manages their tells, through repetition, through iron will, through an absolute refusal to let her interior life show on the surface. In those 20 years, anger had surfaced exactly twice, and neither time had it resembled anger so much as a cold, surgical kind of stillness. This was something else. This was the face that lived beneath the one she showed the world. "My accounts," she said, less a question than a fact she was still making room for. "Frozen," Orville said. "All 4 primary accounts as of 8 o'clock tonight, including the 3 that were held beneath separate corporate structures." He turned a page without raising his eyes. "The shell architecture was carefully built, I'll give you that much. Our forensic accountant spent 14 months charting it end to end, but they finished the map." Nadine's thumb worked across the screen, hunting for access, a transfer portal, an active app, some route that hadn't yet been sealed off. Whatever she found or failed to find drained the motion out of her. "Those accounts," she said, "represent 20 years of assets built from a combination of unauthorized transfers out of joint Whitfield family accounts, commissions on estate transactions that were never disclosed, and 3 distinct episodes of property misrepresentation." Orville's voice didn't shift by a degree. "Every transaction is documented in this section of the portfolio. The IRS received their copy in September." Brendan made a sound, not a word exactly, not quite a breath either, but something hovering between the two. Nadine didn't spare him a glance. She was already deep in her contacts, moving toward a name I could identify, even from across the drive, the entry she had pinned at the very top of her list for as long as I'd known her, her father, Howard Glenfield. 71 years old. The man who had served as her North Star, her blueprint, the silent rationale behind every move she had made under this roof for going on 2 decades. She placed the call. 4 rings, then a woman picked up, crisp, colorless, trained in the delivery of hard news without editorial comment. "The office of Howard Glenfield. Mr. Glenfield is currently unavailable. If this is a family matter, please be advised that Mr. Glenfield's legal counsel has assumed management of all incoming communications effective this evening." She brought the phone down slowly. "What did you do?" Not directed at Orville. At me. I had no answer ready. I was still assembling one myself. My eyes went to Orville. "Howard Glenfield," Orville said, already ahead of the question, "built a moderately successful commercial real estate business across the past 30 years, financed largely through loans from 3 separate lending institutions. Whitfield Holdings, LLC, acquired the senior debt position on each of those loans over the past 18 months as the notes came due and refinancing in the current rate environment proved untenable." A pause. Mr. Glenfield was formally notified of an involuntary Chapter 7 bankruptcy petition at 7:55 this evening. The court accepted the filing at 8 o'clock. His business assets now sit in the hands of a court-appointed trustee. Nadine stood in the snow in front of a house that no longer belonged to her, phone cold in her grip, the storm pressing into every gap of silence around us. "He was your financial backstop," I said. The words hadn't been planned. They came from a region deeper and older than whatever I might call anger. Everything you assembled here, every scheme you set running at the bottom of all of it was the knowledge that if things collapsed, your father could absorb the damage. He was the ground beneath your feet. She turned her eyes toward me. The shock had receded. What was hardening in its place was something I recognized, the look she got when she was working an angle through a problem, finding the seam. "My father," she said with care, "has spent 35 years trying to reclaim what Cyrus stole from him. Everything I did for Mrs. Whitfield." Orville's voice dropped to something quiet and final. "Before that sentence is finished, there is something here you need to read." He reached into the dark burgundy calfskin portfolio and withdrew a document that I could tell at a glance, even from where I stood, was very old. The edges of the paper had gone yellow. The text had been struck on a manual typewriter, the impressions driven deep enough that you could trace them with a fingertip from the reverse side. "This," said Orville, "is the original partnership dissolution agreement between Cyrus Whitfield and Howard Glenfield, signed and notarized on March 14, 1984. He set it on the hood of the nearest car, pressed it flat, and moved aside. "I'd read every word before we go further." Nadine covered the distance to the hood in 3 strides and lifted the document. At first she read fast, the way you read something you expect to serve as a weapon, skimming for the lines that proved what you already knew. Then she slowed. Then she went still entirely. She stood there in the snow, paper held in both hands, working through the same passage a second time, and I watched something move through her face that I had no word for. Not shock and not grief, but the nameless territory that runs between them, the place that hasn't been charted and doesn't have a signpost. A partnership dissolution agreement. March 14th, 1984. 4 pages of the standard legal boilerplate, dense with the smell of old ink and decisions that outlasted the rooms where they were made. At the foot of the 4th page, 2 signatures, Cyrus Raymond Whitfield and Howard J. Glenfield. Below them, added in the margin in Cyrus's tight angular hand, "Fair market value confirmed by Alderman and Webb Associates and Coastal Appraisal Group, 2 independent certified appraisers, November 1983. Clipped behind the agreement, a single sheet of personal stationery. The heading read, "Howard J. Glenfield, with a home address in Marblehead, Massachusetts. Dated 2 weeks after the signing." Orville read it aloud. "Dear Cyrus, Lorraine and I wanted you to know how much these 14 years have meant to us. You built something extraordinary from what was in the beginning, not much more than a good idea and a great deal of stubbornness. I'm proud to have been part of it. The settlement is more money than I ever expected to see in my lifetime, and I leave with no hard feelings and considerable gratitude. Take care of yourself, old friend. Your partner, Howard." A gust moved through the drive, lifting the thin skin of snow that had settled on the nearest car hood and scattering it sideways. Inside the house, the jazz record had run out somewhere along the way, and nobody had put on another. The silence that followed felt chosen. Nadine set the document down. "He told me," she said, her voice barely carrying, "that your father forced him out, that what he walked away with was a fraction of what the stake was actually worth, that Cyrus worked the appraisal process and left him holding almost nothing." She wasn't addressing anyone. She was speaking into the space in front of her, talking to a version of events she had carried for 20 years, and was only now setting side by side with the original finding that the two didn't align. "Your father trusted what he was told," I said. It wasn't meant as an indictment, though I couldn't have said with confidence what it was meant as. That's what people do. "I built everything on that story," she said, and then for one moment, a single unguarded moment, there was nothing left of the performance. No calculation behind her eyes, no quiet management of the impression she was making. There was only a woman standing in the snow, arriving at the understanding that everything she had built her adult life upon rested on a story one man had constructed to make his own choices bearable. I did not feel what I might have anticipated feeling. Orville let the silence hold for a moment before pressing forward. He had the instincts of someone who understood that certain pauses earned their place even when time was short. "There is a related matter," he said, "concerning how Mrs. Whitfield came to learn that Leonard was adopted." Nadine looked up. "In 1988, Orville said, you located a partial document in the household records, a copy of the original adoption filing from 1971. The knowledge of Leonard's adopted status has functioned as a private instrument of pressure in this household ever since deployed in ways subtle enough to resist easy proof but consistent enough to leave a pattern. He moved to the next page. What you didn't know, he said, is that Cyrus placed that document in the household records on purpose. He positioned it somewhere he was confident you would eventually go looking, and he left it in a condition designed to read as an accidental slip on his part. Orville held her gaze. He wanted to observe what you would do with knowledge that could be turned against someone. You gave him his answer within 6 months of finding it. Nadine stood without moving. He knew, she said. He knew from the start. He knew from considerably before the start, Orville said. Which brings us to the matter of the letters. He reached into the portfolio and drew out a bound collection of photocopied pages, perhaps 30 sheets each one, a reproduction of handwritten text. He extended them toward me, not toward Nadine. Your father began composing these in 1994, he said. One each year, always on the same date. They record his observations of every significant person in this household across a span of 30 years. He paused. The originals are in the cedar box in the vehicle. I wanted you to understand the full scope before you sit down with them. 30 years of watching. 30 years of setting it all down in ink. I accepted the photocopies and stood there holding them, not yet opening them. Standing in the snow outside the house where my father had kept his silence for 15 years. Orville turned toward Brendan. Mr. Whitfield, he said, there is one further document in this section. It pertains to you directly and to something you discovered approximately 7 years ago. Brendan had been rooted at the base of the front steps for nearly 20 minutes, motionless, silent, wearing the expression of a man who had concluded that his best available option was to occupy as little of the scene as possible. When his name reached him, what color remained in his face withdrew another shade. I don't know what you're referring to, he said. Orville's smile came and went, small, brief, the expression of a man who had encountered that particular sentence too many times to find it anything but predictable. I think, he said, that you do. Snow compressed under Brendan's shoe as he took a step back. He had always been the one who leaned in, always the one smiling. He stepped back now, and Harvey Orville watched him the way you watch a clock when you already know exactly what the hands are about to show. I don't know what you're referring to, Brendan said again. Orville reached into the dark burgundy calfskin portfolio a second time. This envelope was slimmer than the rest. Plain white, no letterhead, its flap sealed with a strip of red wax the color of dried blood. He broke it open with a letter opener drawn from his coat pocket, unfolded 3 pages, and angled them toward the light thrown by the lead car's headlamps. Whitfield Life and Legacy Trust, he read. Policy number HL-2016-0094. Primary insured Brendan Whitfield. Face value $4,200,000. Accidental death multiplier 2.5. Named beneficiary, as of amendment, dated March 3, 2016. He paused and turned the page toward Brendan. Nadine Ann Whitfield. Nadine did not move. I watched her face, not a flicker, not a flinch. She wore the expression of someone who had long ago rehearsed every conceivable version of this scene and settled on stillness as the only shield that held. Brendan looked at her the way a man looks at a door he has just heard lock from the other side. I signed that years ago, he said. Every married couple carries life insurance. The amendment does not concern the policy itself, Orville said. He refolded the pages with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who owned every second available to him. The amendment concerns a rider added in March of 2018, a rider that removed the standard exclusion applying to death occurring within the first 2 years of policy issuance. He looked at Brendan and did not blink. That exclusion was the only clause standing between a beneficiary and a full collection in the event of a death later ruled non-accidental. Silence. Beyond the tree line, something cracked a branch, giving way under the weight of the snow. Brendan turned to look at Nadine. She was still not looking at him. He understood it now. I heard the cars before I picked them out in the dark. 2 black sedans, unmarked, rolling up the private road at a pace that communicated no hurry because no hurry was required. They came to rest behind the 6 lead vehicles, and the man who climbed from the first sedan was not dressed in a suit. He wore a department coat, dark wool, a badge clipped at his left lapel. He wasn't a tall man, but he carried himself the way certain men do when they've long since earned the right to walk slowly into any room and watch it go quiet. I didn't place him immediately. Orville did. He put out his hand and said, "Chief Halbert Rowan, Halbert Police Chief of Suffolk County, Massachusetts." I would come to understand in the weeks ahead the full significance of that name to everything that had unfolded that night. But standing there, I could only take in what was in front of me, a man in his early 50s, gray-cropped close at the temples, a jaw that looked like it had been braced against hard weather for a very long time, watching Nadine Whitfield with the attention of someone who has been waiting on this particular view for longer than he cares to count. "Mr. Whitfield," he said, and it took me a half-second to register that he was addressing me. "On behalf of the Suffolk County DA's office and the FBI Elder Justice Initiative, I need to put a question to you." He produced a folded document from his inside coat pocket, single-page official letterhead, a yellow tab marking a line near the bottom. "This is a prosecutorial cooperation authorization. It clears our office to move forward with criminal charges tied to the events recorded in the medical reports filed with this office in October of this year." He held it out. "You're not obligated to sign, but if you do, we proceed tonight." I looked at my father. Cyrus was watching the chief. His hands rested folded in his lap, entirely calm, the way they always were when a decision had already been made and he was simply giving the world time to arrive at the same place. He did not look at me. He had no need to. I took the pen Rowan Halbert held out. I set it to the paper. My hand was steady. I signed my name and returned it. Nadine said, "You have no idea what you've just done." I recapped the pen and set it down on the hood of the nearest car. Rowan Halbert folded the authorization and returned it to his coat with the precision of a man who understood exactly what a piece of paper could weigh. Then he looked at me, not the way he had looked at Nadine, measured and cold, the professional assessment of a known threat. He looked at me the way you look at someone you have held in memory for a long time and are only now close enough to address directly. There was something unresolved in it, something entirely apart from the warrant in his coat or the sedans running behind him. "Mr. Whitfield," I said. "Before we move forward," he said, "I need to ask you something. And I need an honest answer, even if that answer is no." I waited. "Do you remember a scholarship," he said, "administered through an anonymous educational trust out of Springfield, Massachusetts, established in 1992, first disbursement fall semester 1993. The cold passed through me in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. I remembered. I hadn't thought about it in years, not because it had ceased to matter, but because that had always been the design. You didn't think about it. You built it, you funded it through a trust clean enough to hold no name, and you let it work quietly, the way the best things sometimes can only work in the dark without witness. 18 children across 11 years. Tuition housing books. No ceremony. No announcement. No expectation of anything given back. I had never known their names. "I remember the trust," I said carefully. Rowan Halbert gave a single nod. "What comes next is the kind of revelation that doesn't announce itself loudly. It arrives quietly, and then it takes everything. Before we get there, let me ask you something. If you discovered that someone had spent years shaping your beliefs to serve their own peace of mind, would you want to know the full truth, or would you rather let it rest?" He reached into his coat the other side this time and drew out a small photograph. Wallet-size, the corners worn soft, the colors carrying the slight fade that comes from years of being handled. He offered it to me. A boy. 12, maybe 13. Standing in front of a brick building, I didn't know, wearing a coat 2 full sizes too big for him, gripping a paper envelope in both hands. He wasn't smiling exactly, but something in his face held a careful, guarded kind of relief. The look of a person who has just learned that the worst outcome they'd braced for isn't coming. I looked at Rowan Halbert. The jaw was the same, the set of the eyes. "The envelope had no return address," he said, "but the postmark was Springfield, and it showed up 3 days after my mother's eviction notice came. We were heading to the shelter the following Monday." He took the photograph back, studied it a moment, then slid it into his pocket. "I spent 11 years trying to find the name behind that trust. By the time I had the resources to pursue it properly, I was already in this position. And by the time I found the name," he paused, "I understood why it had been kept hidden. I had nothing to say. I had never prepared for this conversation, had never conceived of it as something that could happen." "You don't owe me anything," I said. "No," he agreed. "I don't." He turned, slightly glanced toward the estate, then back at me. "But the law doesn't move on debt, and tonight has nothing to do with what you did for a boy in 1993. Tonight is about what the evidence shows." He reached into his coat one final time and produced 2 warrants folded together, each one bearing a different name. These were signed by Judge Bernice Radford of the Suffolk County Superior Court at 6:47 this evening based on the financial records, the toxicology reports, and the camera footage submitted to our office. He passed them to Orville, who looked them over and gave a quiet single nod. Clifton Orville, Halbert said, is currently at his residence in Somerville. Our officers are there now. He spoke the next name without turning toward Nadine. Dr. Aldous Hessler is at Brigham and Women's Hospital working the night shift. He will be removed from the premises before 10 o'clock. Nadine's voice came out drained, stripped of everything it had carried through the evening, the authority, the sureness, the polished ease of a woman accustomed to arranging people and situations and outcomes to her own design. "You can't do this," she said. Rowan Halbert looked at her then once, and what lived in his expression was neither anger nor satisfaction. It was something quieter than both. The look of a man who has done the work as it needed to be done and is watching it reach its end. "Ma'am," he said, "it's already done." He turned to the two officers who had moved forward from the second sedan, both in plain clothes, both carrying the unhurried assurance of people who had been thoroughly briefed and were not anticipating complications. Brendan had not said a word since Orville read the insurance policy aloud. He was standing at the edge of the light thrown by the lead car's headlamps, arms at his sides, his face holding an expression I couldn't name. Not guilt, exactly. Not shock. Something residing between the two. The expression of a man who has spent years maintaining a particular story about himself and has just run out of the language to sustain it. I looked away from him. I looked at my father. Cyrus was watching the estate, the lit windows, the warm amber glow of a house raised on 40 years of silence and patience and labor that no one inside had ever thought to acknowledge. His hands were folded in his lap, entirely still, but his chin was raised just slightly, just enough. Orville did not reach for the satchel. For the first time all evening he set it down, placed it with care on the hood of the lead car, clasped his hands behind his back, and turned to face my father directly. Not to present anything, not to announce anything, simply to look at him the way you look at someone when the formal business of the evening is finished and what remains belongs only to the two of you. "Sir," he said quietly, "I think it's time." Around us no one moved. Nadine had stopped speaking. Brendan had stopped moving. Even the officers from the second sedan had gone still, and I understood without being told that this moment had been designed, that Orville had built the entire evening into a specific sequence, and that this was the point the sequence had been aimed at from the moment he stepped from the lead car and went to one knee in the snow. My father looked at Harvey Orville for a long moment. Then slowly, deliberately, he reached into the inside left pocket of his coat, the one I had stitched shut myself 3 winters ago because he kept misplacing his reading glasses, and he withdrew a folded piece of paper. He held it out. Not to me, not to Orville, to Nadine. She stared at it. She did not take it. So Orville stepped forward and took it himself, unfolded it with the same deliberate steadiness he brought to everything, and read it aloud. A letter dated November 14th, 1994. In my father's handwriting, the tall, slightly backward-leaning script I had known since I was a child, learning to read while perched at the kitchen table looking over his shoulder. The ink had gone the color of old rust, but the words were still entirely clear. "To whom it may concern, and to those who believe they will never be concerned, I have observed over the past several months a pattern of behavior in a young woman who has recently entered this household through my grandson's affections. I do not write this in anger. I write it in the same spirit in which a farmer notes the early signs of drought, not to condemn the sky, but to begin preparing the ground. She is intelligent, she is capable, she is, I believe, genuinely fond of Brendan in the way that people are fond of things they mean to keep. But she looks at this house the way a person looks at a problem she has already committed to solving, and she has begun asking questions. Small ones, careful ones, the kind that do not present themselves as questions at all, about ownership, about inheritance, about what becomes of this family when I am gone. I am writing this letter because I intend to still be here when those questions find their answers, and I intend for those answers to be ones I have already arranged." Orville refolded the letter. The silence that followed was the particular kind that settles over people absorbing something they hadn't expected to feel. I had not known about that letter. I had not known about any of the letters from that time. My father had said nothing, not in 1994, not through the years that came after, not once across 3 decades of shared mornings and quiet evenings, and the small accumulated vocabulary of 2 people who had lived alongside each other long enough to stop needing to explain most things. He had seen it coming in 1994. He had kept it from me because he hadn't wanted me to carry it. because carrying it was his role, and he had decided sometime before I was old enough to understand the weight of such a choice, that shielding me from certain kinds of knowledge was part of what it meant to be a father. Orville spoke again, his voice measured. "For 15 years, he said, Mr. Cyrus Whitfield maintained the appearance of severe cognitive decline. He did not speak, he did not respond. He allowed every person in this household to proceed on the belief that he was no longer present in any meaningful way." He paused. He was present for every word. He reached into his coat, not the satchel, his coat, and produced a bound document. Medical letterhead, 3 signatures at the bottom. Dr. Dorothea Fenlow, in coordination with 2 independent neurologists, conducted a full cognitive assessment on October 8th of this year. Mr. Whitfield scored in the 91st percentile for men of his age group. His hearing is intact. His memory is intact. His legal competency is fully established. Orville set the document on the hood beside the satchel. Every conversation that took place in this house in his presence across the past 15 years he remembers, and a significant portion of it was captured by the device built into the frame of his wheelchair. Nadine's breath escaped as something that was not quite a word. "The recordings," Orville continued, "have been in the possession of the FBI field office in Boston since October 19th. They are currently cataloged as evidence in case number—" He glanced at Rowan Halbert. Halbert provided the number without consulting his notes. Orville gave a nod and returned his attention to Nadine. "He watched," he said simply. "For 15 years he watched and recorded everything he saw. His hands had rested in his lap the entire evening. But now, for the first time, my father turned his head not to Orville, not toward Nadine, not to take in the lit facade of the estate at our backs. He turned to face me. The amber glow from the lead car's lamps fell across him. The snow around us reduced by then to almost nothing, and he looked at me with the same expression he had worn on the night he carried me through the door of this house. I was 7 years old that night. I had not yet understood what the word home could mean to a person. I understood it now. Callum came through the side gate on his own. No one had sent for him. He was holding a small flashlight, the sort that lives in a kitchen drawer for when the power fails, and he covered the distance to us with an unhurried, deliberate step, the bearing of a person who had been waiting on the far side of that gate long enough to decide his waiting was done. He didn't glance at Nadine, didn't glance at Brendan. He went straight to the wheelchair, folded himself down beside it, and looked up at my father. "Ready, Grandpa?" My father's hand lifted from his lap and settled on Callum's shoulder. One press. Intentional, certain. I had made that wheelchair 11 years earlier. Not out of obligation. The market offered plenty of alternatives. Medical catalogs, insurance-eligible options equipment bristling with adjustable components and trade names like Comfort Pro and Mobility Plus embossed on the frames in institutional lettering. I had reviewed all of it. I had ordered 2 different chairs and sent both back inside a week. My father occupied them the way a man occupies a transit seat physically, they're mentally somewhere distant. So I walked out to the workshop behind the house, the one he had put up in 1973, and worked in every weekend until his hands gave out. In the back corner, I found the remaining white oak boards he had milled himself from a tree that had stood at the property's eastern boundary since long before either of us drew breath. A winter storm had felled it in 1971. Rather than sell the timber, my father had processed it himself and stored the planks, saying he was holding them in reserve for something deserving. I built with those boards. 4 months of work. My carpentry was self-taught, and certain passages showed it plainly. The joinery at the left armrest never came out as tight as I'd wanted, and I had to disassemble the front axle housing 3 times before the chair sat true. But the morning I rolled it into the living room, my father passed both hands along the armrests the way you handle a thing you already know, and he pressed his thumb to the wood twice and looked at me. I hadn't known until tonight what he'd quietly done to it afterward. Callum angled the flashlight beneath the seat. He reached under the forward edge, not the cushion, the frame beneath it, the structural oak itself, and pressed a particular point with his thumb. A panel, no wider than a thick book, disengaged with a sound like a latch finding its seat. The compartment held a wax-sealed cedar envelope, and beneath it a photograph. Orville came forward and lifted the envelope out. He cracked the seal and drew from it a document, not 1 page, but a bound gathering of 7, the top sheet carrying the letterhead of a Boston law firm I recognized as one of the oldest practicing in the state. "Last Will and Testament of Cyrus Raymond Whitfield," Orville read. "Executed September 3rd, 2023. Witnessed by 2 independent parties with no beneficial interest in the estate. notarized by a commissioned notary of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. He moved to the final page and read the attestation clause into the cold air. Formal language exact to a degree calculated to endure a courtroom. Then he laid the document on the car hood and turned to the photograph. Small, square-bordered black and white, the dimensions of a camera format discontinued sometime in the early 1970s. The image, my father somewhere in his mid-40s, chin dropped, gaze fixed on an infant tucked against the crook of his arm, his face holding something fierce and private and protective, not a glance toward the camera. Only the child mattered to him. On the reverse side, in his unmistakable script, the hand younger and firmer than the 1994 letter, the dark ink read October 11th, 1965. The day everything became worth it. I stayed with that photograph a long time. Being adopted was not news to me. He had told me when I was 9 a Saturday morning at the kitchen table, and he had done it with the measured care of a man who has turned a conversation over in his mind many times and still finds the delivery hard. He produced the legal paperwork. He answered everything I asked. At the end, he told me that belonging to a person could take more than one form, and that blood was only one of them. I had taken him at his word. I still did. But that photograph was dated 1965. I hadn't come home until 1971. The infant in the picture was not me. Orville held it a moment without speaking. Then he set it gently on top of the will and regarded me with the look of a man carrying something he has been cleared to say and has been holding until the right opening appeared. There is one more thing your father needs you to see first. He looked toward Callum. Callum reached back into the hidden space and brought out a small cedar box the size of a shoebox, no more closed, with a loop of kitchen twine tied in a knot I placed immediately. That knot was mine. I had shown it to Callum when he was 6 years old. The box weighed less than I anticipated. I turned it over in my hands. Cedar sanded down to a smooth finish, the grain running lengthwise, which was how my father had always insisted it should go. He believed wood had its own grain of direction, the same as moving water, and that cutting against it was a dispute you'd never come out ahead of. The kitchen twine was worked into a double hitch with a particular finishing loop I'd once come across in a book of sailing knots. On a wet Saturday with nothing to do, Callum young and restless, I had passed the knot along to him the way you hand children small skills. Not because the skill will matter, but because the act of transmitting it says something nothing else does. My father hadn't been in the room for that lesson. He was at the hospital that week for a follow-up on his hip, and Callum had been 7 at the time, not 6. I had been off by a year. All the same, the knot was flawless. Every loop sat where it belonged. The finishing tuck was exactly right. I looked at Orville. He asked Callum to tie it. Orville said, low and even. 3 weeks ago, he showed him how. I rested the box on the hood and eased the knot apart with my fingers. The twine came free. I opened the lid. A single envelope, its flap, unsealed my name on the front in my father's hand. Not the rust-faded ink of the 1994 letter. This was new, the sheen of a fountain pen that had been used within the past year still faintly visible. A small brass key on a plain ring sat beneath it, and under that a folded card. One line in my father's writing, "When you are ready, not before." I placed the envelope and the key to one side. The time wasn't right. Some part of me understood without needing to be told that sequence was important here, that certain things had to arrive in a particular order. Orville gave a single nod as if he had heard a thought I hadn't voiced. Then he turned to face my father. "Sir," he said quietly, "I believe this is your moment. In the months since that night, I have made many attempts to set down in words what happened next. None of them have satisfied me, and I think none ever will, not because the memory is unclear, but because it operated at a frequency that language wasn't designed to reach. I'll try anyway." My father's hands moved to the armrests of the wheelchair. Not the unconscious shift of a man seeking a more comfortable position. The deliberate, fully inhabited movement of a man who has reached a decision and is now, without hurry, carrying it out. His palms went flat against the oak, and his fingers the fingers that had raised the workshop that had broken down that white oak into boards that had set down 217 letters through 15 years of darkness, spread wide across the grain of wood rooted in this land since before I existed. He pushed. It did not come easily. The effort was visible in the set of his shoulders, in his jaw, in the way each breath came out measured and controlled, the breathing of someone drawing on everything remaining and having quietly decided that everything remaining is precisely sufficient. Callum moved toward him on instinct. I laid my hand on his arm. We held still. My father rose from that wheelchair the way dawn comes up over open country, by degrees unhurried, as though the outcome had been settled from the beginning and only the pace was ever in question. He wasn't steady. His legs hadn't borne his weight in 15 years, and they recalled the assignment the way old things recall what they once knew imperfectly, with strain driven not by any reserve of muscle, but by something harder and less nameable than that. He stood. He was not a tall man. He had never been. But standing there in the New England cold, with the last of the storm clouds peeling back to reveal a sky just beginning to hold stars. My father rose to his full height, and something in the space around him seemed to shift to make room for it. Nadine said nothing. Brendan said nothing. I said nothing. My father's eyes found mine. When he spoke, his voice was rough. 15 years of deliberate silence had worn it down to something low and uneven at its edges, like a road, long closed and only now unsealed, but the words came through clean. "I chose the chair," he said, "so you could keep standing." What followed didn't need anything added to it. Then, after a considerable moment, he turned his head slightly toward Orville. That small turn carried the unmistakable authority of a man issuing an order without needing to raise his voice. Orville reached into his coat. "Phase 2, my father said. 2 words. And inside those 2 words lived every conversation we had never had. Every quiet kitchen morning, every porch evening, every year of silence I had taken for distance. I understood now it had been none of that. It had been architecture. The conference room on the 34th floor of the Whitfield building looked out over the harbor. I had been inside it twice in my life, once in 2002 when my father brought me to execute a document connected to the family trust, and once in 2018 when Brendan convened a meeting to discuss estate planning, and I spent 90 minutes in the chair closest to the door while a room full of people talked through my father's assets as though his death were simply a scheduling matter awaiting a date. Both times I'd come in through the main entrance and been guided to a seat by someone on staff. Both times the message arrived without words: this was not my room. I came through the main entrance now. Nobody guided me anywhere. There were 16 people arranged around the table. I had gone through their names the previous night with Orville board members, senior vice presidents, outside legal counsel. People who had spent years running an $11 billion company under the settled assumption that the question of ownership was long resolved. They looked at me the way people look at a factor they'd left out of their models and were only now being required to account for. Orville came in behind me, Callum behind him. I moved to the head of the table. The chair there was leather, the kind whose price exceeds most people's first vehicles, the kind whose dimensions and materials communicate by themselves that the person who occupies it has been recognized by institutional agreement as the one whose judgment governs the room. I considered it for a moment. Then I looked at Callum. He was already in motion. He had brought it up in the elevator, the wheelchair, the white oak one, the one with the left armrest I'd never gotten quite right, and the hidden compartment now empty. He positioned it at the head of the table to the right of the leather chair, setting it down with the same quiet care you'd bring to placing a photograph on a mantel. I sat in the leather chair. I let the room find its footing. One of the board members, a man in his 60s I recognized as Bernard Aldridge, 22 years with the company chair of the audit committee, leaned forward with the practiced composure of someone who had come through many transitions of leadership and knew that the correct posture in the opening minutes of a new administration was measured attentiveness. "Mr. Whitfield," he said, "on behalf of the board, I want to say that we are prepared to offer our full cooperation through this transition. We understand that significant developments have occurred over the past several days, and we want to assure you that the company's operations have continued without interruption." I nodded. "Thank you, Bernard," I said. The use of his first name was not incidental. 40 years of watching my father handle people had taught me that the quickest way to set the temperature of a room was to speak to it in the register you plan to sustain. And I planned to speak to this room like someone who had been present longer than anyone seated at it, which in the ways that counted I had been. I opened the folder Orville had prepared, single page, 4 items. "I have 3 questions," I said, "and 1 observation, the questions first." The room waited. "What is the average hourly wage of a field worker at our Oklahoma drilling operations?" Silence. Bernard Aldridge glanced left toward the CFO, a woman named Gwendolyn Aldridge, 15 years with the company. She consulted her tablet, scrolled, and gave me a figure. I wrote it down. "What is the current status of the safety incident report filed by the Tulsa field supervisor in August of this year?" The silence that followed was longer and different in character. The silence of people calculating not whether they know the answer, but whether they wish to be the one who delivers it. Eventually, the head of operations, a man named Norman Aldridge, said the report was under internal review. How long had it been under internal review? Approximately 4 months, he said. I wrote that down as well. I set the pen on top of the folder and let my gaze move around the table. My observation, I said, is this. This company was built by a man who spent 40 years arriving at job sites before 4 o'clock in the morning because he believed the person at the top should understand what the work the company lives on actually feels like. I paused. I have not yet arrived at a job site at 4 o'clock in the morning. That will change. No one spoke. I looked at the wheelchair beside me, the white oak armrests, the grain running lengthwise as my father had always insisted it should, the left side carrying the slight imperfection that comes from something made by hand, which is to say, not imperfect at all, only honest. The safety report, I said, will be resolved before this month closes. Not reviewed. Resolved. I closed the folder. Does anyone have questions for me? Bernard Aldridge looked at the wheelchair. Then he looked at me. No, sir, he said. The harbor through the window behind me lay perfectly flat. I counted them twice before I broke the first seal. 218 envelopes, each one closed with the same dark wax, each bearing my name in my father's handwriting on the front. They varied in thickness. Some held what felt like a single folded sheet. Others were full enough that the wax had fractured slightly under the pressure of the contents. They sat in the cedar box in chronological sequence, oldest at the bottom, most recent at the top, held in alignment by a thin strip of white oak, and offcut sanded smooth, the grain matching the wheelchair. Callum had brought the box up from the car and placed it on my desk in silence. He'd stood in the doorway a moment, looking at it, then looked at me and said, "I'll be downstairs if you need anything," and pulled the door shut. That was the right call. He had always understood which moments were someone else's to occupy. I sat at the desk. I lifted the envelope from the bottom of the stack, the earliest one. The wax was darker than the rest, nearly black. Its surface was faintly pitted, the years having settled into it. My name on the front was in the hand I had always known, but younger, the letters a fraction looser, the pressure behind the pen lighter, as though the hand that wrote it hadn't yet arrived at the deliberateness that would accumulate over the decades to come. The postmark on the reverse read December 26, 2008. The morning after the first Christmas, my father had passed in silence. I broke the seal. December 26, 2008. Leonard, you made oatmeal this morning, the kind with the maple syrup and the raisins. Because you recalled that I used to ask for it on winter mornings when you were small. You never brought up the memory. You simply made it, placed it on the tray, and walked back to clean the pan. I need you to know that I saw it. I see all of it. That is the thing I need you to understand, even if I am not yet able to say so directly. Leonard. I set the letter aside. I sat there a long while holding the quiet weight of it. The peculiar density of a man at his desk in the dark, writing about oatmeal and raisins. Because it was the last means available to him to say I am still present and I am paying attention. I reached for the next one, pulled at random from the pile of fatter envelope from 2012. The wax seal pressed with something round the rim of a coin perhaps, or a ring. March 14th, 2012. Leonard, you repaired the hinge on my bedroom door today. That hinge had been announcing itself for 6 weeks. I know you registered it every morning. I watched you stop in the hallway each time you went by, that brief pause, that particular moment of calculation where a man decides whether to log something for later or handle it on the spot. You handled it on the spot. You crossed to the workshop, located what you needed, and were finished in 4 minutes. Nadine observed this from the landing above. No word of thanks. She turned and disappeared back into her room. I made note of that too. CRW. The door had slipped entirely from my mind. Every detail of it, the specific pitch of that squeak, the particular morning, the 4 minutes at the workbench, gone. My father had held on to all of it. He had committed it to paper in March of 2012 and pressed the seal shut with what I could now make out, squinting at the wax impression, was the signet ring he had carried on his right hand for as long as I could remember. I lifted the third letter, 2016, fatter than the last, July 4th, 2016. Leonard Callum came off his bicycle this afternoon on the lower path. He took the skin off his left palm. You were inside the workshop and missed it entirely. Yet 3 minutes afterward you appeared at the door. I cannot say what sound reached you or whether it was no sound at all, that particular hush that settles after a child is hurt. But you moved straight to him, eyes forward, unhesitating, the way someone walks to a place they were already certain they needed to reach. You tended to the scrape without ceremony, no alarm, no fuss. You said that the hands that get scraped are the hands doing the learning, and that learning anything worth knowing carries a price. The crying stopped. 70 years I have been searching for counsel better than that. I have come up empty. C.R.W. That letter made me set everything down for a while. I crossed to the window. Beyond the glass, the Whitfield estate lay dark. The grounds were still beneath a shallow skin of new-fallen snow. At the far edge of the tree line, I could make out the workshop roof. The lamp above its door was lit. I had left it burning the night I completed the wheelchair 11 years back and never once returned to switch it off. 11 years of continuous light. At some point, I had simply ceased to register it. I returned to the desk and drew out the envelope from 2020, the year Nadine had begun moving money, the year the records would eventually establish she had made first contact with Clifton Orville. None of that had been visible to me in 2020. What I had felt was only that the atmosphere inside the house had altered the way barometric pressure alters ahead of a front, and I could not put my finger on why. November 11th, 2020. Leonard, your sleep has grown thin. I catch you in the kitchen at 2 o'clock and 3 o'clock in the morning, not cooking, not drinking, just planted at the counter with the lights off. That ground is familiar to me. 2 years I stood at that same counter after your mother was gone, running my hands along the seam of the moment everything broke open, as if locating it with enough precision might give me something to grip. It does not work that way. What I want you to hear is this. The thing you are picking up on is not a phantom. It is there. You are not a man who conjures dangers out of nothing, and this is no exception. Hold to what you know. It has been my compass for 40 years without a single failure. C.R. The final envelope in the stack bore the date December 25th, 2023, the night the storm came through. I turned it in my hands without opening it. The wax was whole, unbroken. The seal sat as clean and flush as the day it was pressed. My name across the front carried the same fountain pen hand as every other letter, the ink still faintly alive with its sheen. I laid it flat in the middle of the desk. Not tonight. What was inside belonged to a task I had no business beginning yet. The remaining letters I gathered with care, nestled them back into the cedar box in the sequence I had found them, and rested the white oak strip back into place across the lid. The workshop light was still going outside. It would wait. On the morning of January 3rd, fog rolled in from the harbor and draped itself across the city the way fog does when it has no intention of moving on, no drift, no progression. Simply there, the variety of weather that seems to muffle everything inside it, to lift events slightly out of the range of ordinary feeling. I pulled up to Suffolk County Superior Court at 7:45 in the morning. The building was granite old New England stock cut and laid in the 19th century by men who built with the quiet certainty that their institutions would be standing long after everyone who raised them was gone. The broad front steps had been worn hollow in their centers by a century and a half of footsteps climbing them with grievances to press or accounts to settle. It was the first time I had ever stood on them. I took up a position on the fourth step and kept my eyes on the street. Harvey Orville was already in place. He held a cup of coffee he was not drinking and carried a briefcase with nothing in it that needed doing. The machinery for that morning had been engaged and running for days. He passed me the cup in silence and I took it in kind. "She'll come out from the side entrance," he said. "That's how they handle high-profile arraignments. Keeps the front cameras out of the picture." "How many cameras are out front?" He looked briefly toward the street. "Enough." I had given the press nothing. No statement, no returned messages, no permission for my name to surface in any of the reporting that had been cycling since Christmas Day when the first wave broke. Elder abuse allegations rock Boston family. Whitfield oil heir. Investigated the kind of language that takes 20 years of slow, careful work and renders it down to a caption under a photo. I had not read a word of any of it. Callum had read everything and distilled the pieces that were factually wrong, which accounted for most of them. At 8:12, the side door came open. Nadine stepped out, flanked by 2 federal marshals, not local officers. Federal. The elevation of the charges in the 4 days since Christmas Eve had been something I anticipated in outline, but the reality of those jackets made it concrete in a way I had not quite prepared for. She had on the same clothes from when she was processed, the dark green dress from the party, its belt gone now, and a county-issue cardigan in gray that swallowed her by 2 sizes. Hair drawn back, the earrings absent. She looked in a way I had never witnessed across all the years I had known her, like someone who had been measured against the actual dimensions of what she had done. I had spent the interval between Christmas Eve and this morning turning over the question of what I would feel at this moment. I had assumed anger the straightforward, self-knowing kind. What arrived instead was something murkier and considerably less clean. A deep fatigue of recognition, the sensation of a man who has spent years watching a structure develop a lean, who now stands on the opposite curb as it finally gives way, and discovers that the collapse itself, stripped of all the weighting, is mostly just noise. She caught sight of me on the steps. Her stride broke one beat no more until the marshal to her left touched her elbow and the motion resumed. But inside that beat her eyes found mine, and what moved between us bore no resemblance to the way enemies look at one another. It was the look that passes between two people who have occupied the same table for 20 years and have at last, and without possibility of reversal, exhausted every remaining thing they might have said. Neither of us spoke. The marshals walked her to the transport vehicle, the door shut behind her, and it disappeared into the fog. And that was the last time I saw Nadine Whitfield as a free person. Harvey Orville spoke in a low voice beside me. The asset forfeiture order was signed by Judge Radford at 6 o'clock this morning. Every domestic account, the Back Bay property, the vehicles, the contents of the safe deposit box at First Commonwealth, all of it. The Cayman accounts are pending international cooperation, but the FBI anticipates full recovery within 60 days. He paused. Her personal net worth as of this morning is approximately negative $400,000. That's the legal fees she's already run up. I looked at the space where the transport vehicle had been. "And Brendan," I said. Orville was quiet for a moment. "He came in voluntarily on the 27th with his own attorney, not Clifton Orville, someone clean, a public defender actually, which I think tells you something about where his head was. He gave a full statement. He confirmed the insurance policy amendment, the mortgage documents, the account transfers." Another pause, longer this time. "He said he learned about the poison 2 years ago. That he confronted her once, and she told him the dose was low enough that it wouldn't do lasting harm and that it would stop once the inheritance was secured." Orville set his untouched coffee on the step beside him. He believed her. I didn't say what I thought about that. I wasn't sure I had standing to. "What happens to him?" I asked. "Cooperation agreement. He'll testify at trial. In exchange, the federal charges come down significantly. He'll likely serve time. The state charges are harder to soften, but substantially less than Nadine." Orville studied me carefully. "How do you feel about that?" I thought about the boy Brendan had been at 19, frightened without parents. That particular exhaustion in a child who has absorbed the lesson that adults say things they have no intention of honoring. I thought about the man he had grown into or allowed himself to become or been gradually remade into by 20 years of Nadine's patient, methodical rewriting of his sense of what the world owed him. I thought about my father's voice on the night of the storm. "I chose the chair so you could keep standing. That's the law's call to make," I said, "not mine." Orville gave a single nod. The fog was beginning to dissolve at its edges, harbor light filtering through in pale strips. That tentative early morning brightness that has not yet committed to becoming a full day, but is moving steadily in that direction. Callum appeared at the foot of the steps, both hands in his coat pockets, and looked up at me with the expression he had inherited from his grandfather. That measured, guarded patience that makes no demands and withholds nothing. "Ready," he said. I picked up the briefcase Orville had left beside me. It was heavier than I had anticipated, and then it came back to me what was inside. The will, the letters, the brass key, the photograph from 1965, and I understood at once why. Of course it was heavy. Some things are meant to be. "Yes," I said. "Let's go." The clock on the wall of room 417 read 3:48 when I got there. Not my phone. The wall clock, the old institutional variety, black numerals, a second hand that advanced in distinct ticks rather than a fluid sweep. The kind of clock hospitals favor because someone decided long ago that the passage of time in places like this ought to be visible, precise, and impossible to look away from. I had been watching it for over an hour when my father opened his eyes. He had been in decline since February, not steeply, not in the manner that announces itself and insists on being answered, but in the quiet, incremental way that very old things decline when they have completed what they set out to accomplish and are simply waiting on the formality of an ending. Dr. Fenlow had been straightforward with me in March. His organs were holding, his mind was clear, but a body at 100 years old runs on a different economy than the rest of us, and the account was running thin. Callum was asleep in the chair by the window. He had been there since 11 o'clock the previous night, unwilling to go, which was something I understood without reservation and made no attempt to argue. My father opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling for a moment, the way a person takes in a familiar room they are seeing with full clarity for the first time in some while. Then he turned his head and looked at me. "Leonard," he said. His voice was thin now, not the rough road-clearing voice of Christmas Eve, but something quieter. The voice of a man who has spent his whole life choosing his words with care, who has a small number remaining and means to spend them deliberately. "I'm here," I said. He moved his hand across the blanket toward me. I took it. His fingers were cold the way hands turn cold when the body has begun pulling its remaining warmth inward toward the core. I held them between both of mine and kept my thoughts away from what that coldness signified because there was nothing to be gained by going there. He said, "There is something I should have told you 40 years ago. You don't have to." "I do." A pause. The second hand moved 3 ticks. "The photograph in the wheelchair, October 11th, 1965. I waited. "That was me," he said, "in the photograph, and the child." He stopped, gathered himself, went on. "That child was yours to inherit from the first moment I held you. But it was not adoption, Leonard. I need you to understand that. You were never adopted." The clock ticked. "Your mother's name was Rosalind Ruth Feuenmayer," he said. "She was 24 years old. We were not married. That was my failure, not hers, and I have carried it for 60 years. She died 11 days after you were born. Complications that should not have been complications in 1965. That would not be complications now. And I have spent a great deal of money and a great deal of anger trying to make some kind of accounting for it, neither of which has ever been adequate." His hand tightened slightly on mine. "I placed you with a family in Springfield. I told myself it was because I couldn't raise an infant on my own. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth." I did not speak. "The whole truth," he said, "is that I was afraid. I was 46 years old and I had built something, the company, the estate, all of it. And I was afraid that if I claimed you openly, the people who wanted what I had built would use you to reach it. So I waited, I watched, I made arrangements through people I trusted." A breath. "And when you were 6 years old, I came to Springfield and I brought you home. And I told you that you were adopted because that was the story that kept you safe. And I told myself I would tell you the truth when the moment was right." The second hand moved. "I kept finding reasons," he said quietly, "why the moment was not yet right." Callum shifted in the chair by the window but did not wake. I looked at my father's face, the face I had known for 52 years, the face I had watched move from vigorous middle age through careful old age into this final stripped-down version of itself that was somehow more essentially him than any of the earlier versions had been. The broad forehead, the set of the jaw, the eyes that were I had always thought unusually dark for a man of his coloring. My eyes. I had always taken that for a coincidence. "You don't need to apologize," I said. My voice came out steadier than I had expected. "I know what you were doing. I know what all of it was." He held my gaze for the long moment. "I know you do," he said. "That's why I could trust you with it." Dr. Fenlow came in quietly at 4:30 to check his vitals and looked at me over his head with the particular expression that doctors develop for conveying certain things without language. I nodded. She adjusted something on the monitor and left without a word. My father slept after that, and I sat with him. Callum woke somewhere around 5 o'clock and came to stand beside me and laid his hand on my shoulder without speaking. And the 3 of us were together in that room, grandfather, father, son. In the particular quiet of people who have said what needed saying and are now simply present with one another, which is the only thing left to be once the words are done. The clock read 5:12 when the monitor changed. I did not take my eyes from my father's face. He looked at the end entirely at peace, the way a man looks when he has finished a very long piece of work, set it down, and stepped back to see whether it held together the way he meant it to. It had. It was the last week of April before I opened it. Not because it had slipped my mind. I had thought about it every day since Christmas Eve, the way you circle a door, opens onto something that matters, uncertain whether you are ready to step through it. There had always been something else demanding attention first: the arraignment, the board sessions, the asset transfers, the calls from Harvey Orville, the calls from the Oklahoma field supervisor about the safety report, which had been resolved as promised before the end of January. There had been Callum and the estate and the 100 small administrative duties that trail the close of a very long chapter, the kind that keep your hands busy while your mind works to catch up. But the real reason was simpler. I had been waiting until I could sit with the letter without needing it to deliver anything beyond what it actually was. Callum brought it to me on a Tuesday morning in late April. The envelope still sealed my name, still on the front in my father's hand, the ink carrying that faint fountain pen sheen. He set it on the desk without a word and left the door open as he went his way of staying close without intruding. A distinction I suspected he had absorbed from watching his grandfather practice it for 20 years. I sat down. I broke the seal. December 25th, 2023. Leonard, by the time you read this, the trap will have been sprung and the night will be behind you and you will be standing somewhere on the far side of it working out what it all means. I want to offer you that before you spend too long arriving at it alone, because you have always had a tendency to shoulder more of the weight of things than is rightfully yours to carry, and I have watched you do it for 52 years and told myself each time that it was part of what made you who you are. I still hold to that. But I want to give you this before I go. Here is what it means. Everything I built was always meant for you. Not solely because of blood, though I want you to know at last fully and without reservation that the blood is there and has been from the very beginning. The only reason I kept that from you longer than I should have is one I have spent too many years being ashamed of. That shame is mine to carry, not yours. What it means is that the company, the estate, the 40 years of effort, none of that was ever the point. The point was the man I watched you become in spite of every reason to become someone lesser. The point was the wheelchair you built from wood I had set aside for something worth the making. The point was the oatmeal with the maple syrup and the raisins on cold mornings when you assumed no one was tallying. Someone was always tallying. I want you to know that. I also want to say something about what lies ahead, because there is work ahead, and I know you well enough to be certain you already sense this and are already moving toward it in that quiet, methodical fashion of yours that other people read as patience, and that is actually something more exacting than patience. It is the willingness to do the right thing at the right moment, and not a moment before it, which is rarer than most people recognize and worth more than anything I am leaving you in legal documents. The Oklahoma fields employs 612 people as of this writing. Over the years, I have come to know most of them not as their employer, not through formal introductions, but as a man who showed up at job sites before sunrise, learned their names, and understood that a company is not its balance sheet. It is its people. It has always been its people. That is what I need you to carry forward, because it is the thing most vulnerable to being lost once the numbers grow large enough to stop feeling like human beings. Go to Oklahoma, Leonard. Not for a board meeting, not to make an announcement. Go the way I used to go, early, unannounced, with enough time to sit down to breakfast with the people who keep the whole thing running. Find out their names. Find out what they need. Build the thing worth building. The brass key in the cedar box opens the filing cabinet in the workshop, the locked one, the bottom drawer. The one I told you held old tax records. It does not hold old tax records. It holds 30 years of correspondence with every person I counted as a partner in the truest sense of the word. The field supervisors, the engineers, the woman in Tulsa who has been running the Eastern operation since 1986, and whom I have been paying 30% less than her male counterparts for reasons I cannot defend and have been attempting to correct for the last 4 years without sufficient urgency. Everything else will follow from that. I have tried across 217 letters to pass on everything I observed. This last one is not about what I observed. It is about what I believe. I believe you are going to be all right. I believe the company will be better in your hands than it ever was in mine, not because you are more capable, though you are, but because you care about the right things in the right order, and that is the only qualification that has ever meant anything. I love you, Leonard. I should have said it more plainly more often, and somewhere other than a letter composed at midnight. Consider this my correction. Your father, Cyrus Raymond Whitfield. I refolded the letter along the creases it already held and sat with it for a while. Through the window, the Whitfield estate was fully in leaf. The long New England spring having arrived at last in the final week, the grounds carried that particular quality of light that comes when the cold has finally broken, when everything feels new again, and the distance between where you stand and where you are headed seems, for the first time in a long while, like something other than an obstacle. I reached for my phone and called Callum. "Get the car ready," I said when he picked up. "We're going to Oklahoma." A pause then. "When?" "Tomorrow morning," I said, "early." Nadine stood in the snow with the dissolution agreement held in both hands. I watched her read it a second time, the way a person reads something when the first pass has already taken the ground out from under them, and they are hoping the second will reveal some interpretation the words have not yet yielded. It did not. The document was precisely what it appeared to be. A clean, fair, mutually agreed termination of a 35-year partnership settled at market value, witnessed and notarized with a handwritten letter attached that used the words, "no hard feelings" and "considerable gratitude" in the same sentence, and meant both of them. The story she had constructed her entire adult life upon was not a story about injustice. It was the story of a man who could not make peace with the ordinary plainness of his own achievement, and who had reworked his past across the years until the revision felt more true than the original, and had then handed that revision to his daughter as though it were something she was owed. Standing there, I understood that Nadine had never examined it, not once. Why would she? The grievance had come to her fully assembled, villain already in place, moral already drawn, and she had been young enough when she first received it to take it in the way children take everything in completely, without the evaluative remove that only arrives later, if it ever does. She had grown up inside that story. It had shaped her choices, her marriage, her sense of what this house owed her and what she owed it in return, none of which made what she had done forgivable. But some of it made it there in the cold air outside the house where I had lived for 52 years briefly comprehensible. Harvey Orville reached into the portfolio again. "There is something else," he said, "connected to the dissolution, specifically to what your father did with his settlement." He produced a document I had not seen before, not among the family records, not among anything I had encountered in Orville's portfolio to that point. It was a certified copy of a corporate filing, the kind issued by a state registry bearing the seal of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and a date in the autumn of 1985, Whitfield Capital Partners. Orville read aloud, "A limited partnership organized under Massachusetts law, funded on October the 3rd, 1985 with a founding contribution of $400,000. He looked up at Nadine. "The settlement your father received from the dissolution of his partnership with Cyrus Whitfield was $412,000. Within 8 months of receiving it, he had converted the entirety of it into the founding capital of his own commercial real estate enterprise." Nadine's expression shifted slightly. "That company," Harvey Orville continued, "turned a profit for 6 consecutive years. It moved into residential development, acquired 2 commercial properties in Back Bay in 1993, and by 1996 was carrying assets valued at approximately $9 million. He set the document on the hood beside the dissolution agreement. "Your father did not lose his stake in the Whitfield partnership. He received fair market value for it, put it to work, and built something substantial with it for more than a decade." "Then what happened?" I said quietly, not to dispute him, but because I genuinely needed to understand. "Did he tell her something different?" Orville was still for a moment. He had the manner of a man who had long since learned to distinguish between the facts of a situation and the forces behind it, and who gave both equal professional weight, because in 1997 he said the man made 3 consecutive investment decisions that did not perform. Leveraged positions in commercial development during a period of climbing interest rates. The assets he had assembled over 12 years contracted sharply within an 18-month window. By 2000, the enterprise was a fraction of what it had been at its height. A pause. He never climbed back to where he had once stood. And a man who watches something he built shrink toward its starting point needs somewhere to place the reason. The reason he settled on was Cyrus Whitfield. The snow had nearly stopped. The air was cold and motionless and very clear, the kind of clarity that trails bad weather and opens up distances that had been invisible an hour before. Nadine lowered the dissolution agreement slowly. "He told me the story for the first time when I was 14, she said. The operational quality had drained entirely from her voice. She was not addressing Orville, not addressing me, not speaking to any particular audience. She was speaking the way people speak when they are sorting through something in real time and cannot afford to care who is listening. I came home from school and found him at the kitchen table with a drink he wasn't finishing, and he looked at me the way he sometimes looked when he'd been sitting with something difficult for a long time, and he told me about the partnership and what Cyrus had done to him." A pause. "He cried. I had never seen him cry before. I was 14 years old and my father was crying, and I made up my mind right then that I was going to fix it." She went quiet. "I spent 20 years trying to fix it," she said. "Everything I did in this house, every decision, every plan, every arrangement, all of it was aimed at that. At recovering what I believed had been taken from my family." There was something in her voice I had never once heard across 20 years of knowing her. It was not an appeal. It was not a maneuver. It was the sound of someone setting down a burden they had carried so long they had ceased to feel its weight. I did not forgive her in that moment. I want to be plain about that, because plainness matters here and the situation is not served by sentiment. What she had done, The poison, the forgery, the methodical and patient erosion of my father's safety and my own, none of it belonged to a category that the truth about her father could dissolve. She had made choices. She had made them repeatedly across years with full knowledge of where they led. The origin of an impulse does not reassign the moral weight of the act. But I understood something that night I had not understood before. The cruelty had not been invented. It had been planted in a 14-year-old girl seated across from a weeping father at a kitchen table. And she had tended it faithfully for 20 years without once stopping to ask whether the seed itself was true. Orwell placed one final document on the hood. It was a letter recent, the paper still carrying the slight stiffness that indicates something printed within the past few months. The letterhead read, Howard J. Glenfield, Private Correspondence. The date was September 14th, 2023. Orwell did not read it aloud. He looked at Nadine. Your father wrote this letter to my office, he said, on September 14th of this year, after we informed him that the evidence gathered against you had been submitted to the FBI. He did not contact his attorney. He did not contact you, he wrote this letter. A pause. In it, he states, and I am quoting directly, that everything he told you about the Whitfield partnership dissolution was built from his own bitterness and self-deception, and that he has known for many years that the settlement was fair. He states further that he told you the story not to harm you, but because you were the only person in his life who believed him without reservation, and that your belief made the story feel more real to him than the truth. Orwell refolded the letter along its crease. He asked that we make sure you saw it. He said, and again I am quoting directly, she deserved the truth before the consequences. I cannot give her the truth after. Someone else will have to. Nadine stood absolutely still. The dissolution agreement in her hands, the notarized signatures, the attached letter of genuine gratitude had ceased to function as evidence and become something else entirely. I was not sure there was a precise name for what it had become. I looked at my father. He was watching her. Not with judgment and not with satisfaction, but with the particular expression of a very old man who has outlasted a great deal of human foolishness and has learned to separate the people who act from the forces that form them without mistaking that distinction for an excuse. His thumb pressed once against the armrest, slow and deliberate, the way he pressed it when something had been confirmed rather than when something had been won. Brendan was sitting on the bottom step of the front porch, elbows on his knees, hands loosely clasped, looking at the ground between his shoes. He had not spoken since Orwell began reading from that section of the portfolio. He was not, I thought, working through the legal situation. He was working through the older, simpler, more personally devastating question of what it means to have watched someone take everything you were handed and use it to construct something that was never what it appeared to be, and to have allowed it because the alternative demanded more than you could give. That was a question I could not answer for him. It was barely a question I could answer for myself. The fog that had been gathering at the tree line all evening finally reached the drive. It moved in the way fog does when it has settled on staying, closing around the cars, the standing figures, the iron gate, until the outer edges of everything softened, and only what was directly in front of you remained fully in focus. Orwell closed the portfolio, without ceremony. Simply closed it the way you close something when what it contained has been delivered and what remains belongs to the people present rather than the papers between them. I believe, he said, looking at me, that this concludes the evidentiary portion of the evening. He glanced toward Rowan Halbert. Halbert gave a single nod, the nod of a man who has been holding his position with professional patience and has recognized that his moment has arrived. He stepped forward. I used to think silence was the same as conceding the ground. It was not. It was patience of a deliberate kind, the sort that does not announce itself because it has no need to. My father left me one truth that reached beyond the company, beyond the letters preserved in the cedar box, beyond the oak wheelchair beside my chair in that boardroom. What is done in the dark does not stay there. Every concealed account, every forged signature, every calculated act of cruelty finds its reckoning not always on the schedule we would choose, but always. That is what it looks like when the long work finally completes itself. Not in rage, but in record, in the quiet, irrefutable weight of a man who wrote down everything he witnessed because he believed that what was true was worth keeping. Protect the people in your care before the storm arrives, and understand that betrayal built on deception carries only what it deserves. In the end, an empty room and an account drawn to zero. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. That says something about you. I have been thinking about what a tale like this one costs and what it leaves behind. Leonard carried the weight of a house that was never fully his, a name he thought he had borrowed, and a father who loved him in the most careful, most guarded way a frightened man knows how. And Cyrus, who sat still for 15 years so his son could keep standing, paid a price most of us will never be asked to pay. I believe God sees that kind of sacrifice, the kind that never gets announced, the kind that works in the dark, in silence across decades and still holds together in the end. That is the heart of the grandpa revenge stories that stay with you longest, not the confrontation, but the patience behind it. Here is what I take from it. Keep your records. A man who writes down what he witnesses leaves behind something that cannot be argued with. Do not inherit a grievance without checking its roots. The story you were handed may have been built to make someone else's failure easier to live with. Protect the people in your care before the storm arrives. Not after, before. And when someone shows you patient, consistent love, notice it, even in its smallest forms, especially then. These are the father stories that remind me why endurance matters more than noise. Quiet people sometimes carry the loudest truths. If this one stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below. I read them and they matter to me. And if you haven't yet subscribed to Grandpa's Revenge, there are more stories here worth your time. Thank you for being here. Until next time.